Hi and welcome to the JMeter tutorial. Okay, so now let us begin with the Apache JMeter tutorial. First, I will be giving you a brief overview of JMeter, then followed by the installation of JMeter, and finally we will look at the operation of JMeter. Okay, so now to begin with the overview of JMeter. First of all, JMeter is an open source testing software. It is a 100% pure Java application and it can run on any workstation or environment that has Java 6 or higher. In fact, a list of all the operating systems, the architectures as well as the Java version supported is being posted on the official JMeter website, which is the Apache JMeter.org. Next, JMeter was designed to measure performance. That is, specifically it is a tool to perform performance testing on various systems, servers, applications, etc. So now to begin, now let us first understand the definition of a performance test. A performance test is a technical investigation that is done to determine or validate the responsiveness, the speed, the scalability, and the stability characteristics of the product under test, which may be a server, a system, an application, a web service, etc. And Apache JMeter can be used to test performance upon both static as well as dynamic resources. Some of the resources which can be tested using JMeter include web services such as SOAP and REST, web dynamic languages such as PHP, Java, ASP.NET, and files, etc., Java objects, databases, queries, FTP servers, and much more. In fact, a detailed introduction as well as tutorials to JMeter can be found on the Apache JMeter website. So several test plans have been demonstrated in this video, as well as practical assignments are being provided to test your knowledge later. Okay, so now we will begin with the JMeter installation. It has 4 steps, as you can see. First is to install the JDK 6 or higher, then you need to download JMeter, then install JMeter, and then simply launch the JMeter. So the steps to install JMeter are very straightforward and simple, and it can be completed in a couple of minutes. Now we'll begin with the first step, that is installation of JDK 6 or higher. So I'm just going to search for install JDK for Windows 7. Go to the first link, which is the Oracle website. Select to download JDK. Accept the terms and conditions. And download the Java Development Toolkit file for Windows 7 64-bit. This download may take a couple of minutes. It's still getting downloaded. Just a few seconds more. Now open the exe file. The installation wizard has opened. Click Next. Select the location where you want to store the file. Again click Next. Now the Java installation has begun. This might take a couple of minutes. So during the time I'll be telling you a little about the installation of JMeter. First of all, JMeter is a pure Java application and it can run correctly on any system which has a compatible Java implementation. But however, JMeter works on systems only when it's possible to install JDK 6 or higher. Now I'll tell you for the list of operating systems, the JVM version which can be used as well as the architecture. For operating system free BSD 9.0 onwards, JVM 6 or higher can be used. For Linux operating systems version 2.4, 2.6 and 3.1, Sun JDK 5, 6, 7 and Open JDK 6 can be used. For Mac operating system, JDK 6 or higher needs to be used. For Windows XP operating system, Sun JDK 6 or Sun JDK 7 needs to be used for 62 as well as 64 bits. For Windows 7, Sun JDK 5, 6 and 7 versions are supported, and this is for 32-bit architecture. So we are currently in the first stage, which is installing of Java. The Java installation is pretty slow, but once this is done, installation of JMeter becomes very simple and it can be done in a couple of minutes. So if you want, you can change the destination folder. I would like to leave it at that in C drive and program files. The installation is almost complete for JDK 6.
A few years ago, I started to watch the teachers around me passing me.
It's almost done. So now the installation is complete. You can click close. Now to check if your JDK 6 or higher has been installed properly, follow these steps. Open command prompt in the administrator mode. Navigate to the folder where you have installed JDK 6 in your computer. I have installed it in the program files folder of C drive, hence I am moving to that. Then run the command java-version. It will show you a success message, and then you'll know that your JDK is installed rightly. So now your next step is to install JMeter. Again, just type in the key phrase install JMeter in Google and just follow the first link, which will lead you to the official website of JMeter, which is Apache JMeter. Download the latest release of the binaries from there. Save your file. The download will take a couple of seconds. Now open the folder. Now you can see the contents of the bin folder, the docs folder, the extras, and the library. These are the 4 critical folders needed for JMeter's proper functioning. So the next step is to launch your JMeter. For that you need to open the command prompt in the administrator mode. Again, navigate to the location in your computer where you have installed the JMeter folder. I am navigating it to the location where I have stored it, which is in C drive in a folder called Apache JMeter 2.13. Navigate to the bin folder inside that and run the JMeter in batch file using the command jmeter.bat. Now this is the GUI version of the Apache JMeter. So now I will take you through the working of JMeter since the installation is complete. First, to begin with, I would like to say that JMeter is a 100% pure Java application designed to load test client server software such as web applications. It is used to performance test both on static and dynamic resources such as static files, Java servlets, ASP.NET, PHP, CGI scripts, Java objects, databases, FTP servers, and much more. What JMeter does is it stimulates a heavy load on a server network or an object to test its strength or to analyze the overall performance under different load types. It also helps you regression test your application. And next comes building of a test plan. The fundamental unit of JMeter is the test plan. It can be viewed as a container for running tests. It basically defines what actions that have to be taken by the JMeter in order to complete the test. It describes a series of steps JMeter will execute when run. The elements of a test plan are shown there. The elements include the thread groups, the logic controllers, the sample generating controllers, the listeners, the timers, the assertions, and the configuration elements. The details of each of these elements will be explained in the further slides. So essentially what JMeter does is it creates requests to the target server by stimulating a heavy load. The server responds, JMeter saves all these responses, and JMeter gathers data to calculate statistical information. And the information that is gathered is published in the form of a performance report in order to understand the performance of your system under test. First comes a thread group. Thread group is nothing but a set of elements which form the beginning points of a test plan. Each thread stimulates a user that is accessing the system or the server under test. Thread group elements control the number of threads JMeter will use to execute the test. The controls you can set for a thread group allow you to set the number of threads, each thread corresponding to a single user. Set the ramp up period, which refers to the number of seconds within which all the requests should have been sent, and it also indicates the number of times the test has to be executed. Multiple threads are being used to stimulate concurrent connections to your server applications. So for example, if you set your ramp up time to 0, that means all the 100 requests, suppose the number of threads is 100, will be sent to the server at the same instance, at the same time instance. That is the significance of the ramp up period. Next comes the sample generating controllers. Samplers allow JMeter to send specific type of requests to a server. They stimulate a user request for a page from the target server. For example, you can add a HTTP request sampler if you need to perform a post, get, or delete operation on a HTTP service. The types of samplers include HTTP for HTTP requests, FTP for FTP requests, JDBC requests for databases, Java requests, as well as SOAP and XML requests. to elaborate a little more about the sample generating controllers, first we'll look into the HTTP request. This sampler lets you send a HTTP or a HTTPS request to the web server. It also lets you control whether or not JMeter parses HTML files for images and other embedded resources. The FTP request lets you send a FTP retrieve file or upload file request. The JDBC request lets you send a request to a JDBC sampler. Then SOAP, XML and RPC request lets you send a SOAP request to a web service. It can also be used to send XML RPC over HTTP. It creates a HTTP post request with the specified XML as the post content. Next we will look at the timers. By default, a JMeter thread sends requests without pausing between each sampler. This may not be what you want. Timer elements can be added which allow you to define a period to wait before each request being sent to the system or the server under test. Some of the commonly used timers in JMeter are as below. First is the constant timer. If you want to have each thread pause for the same amount of time between requests. Then comes the Gaussian random timer. This timer pauses each thread request for a random amount of time, with most of the time intervals occurring near a particular value. The total delay would be sum of all the Gaussian distributed value times the deviation value you specify and the offset value. Uniform random timer. This timer pauses each thread request for a random amount of time, with each time interval having the same probability of occurring. The total delay is the sum of the random value as well as the offset value. And last comes the constant throughput timer. This timer introduces variable pauses in such a way that they are calculated to keep the total throughput in terms of samples per minute as close as possible to a particular figure, which is given by you and preset by you. Next we move on to the assertions. One of the interesting factors of JMeter is that it not only helps you to determine the time taken for a particular server or a system under test to perform a particular function, but it also measures if the value being written by it is accurate and what you had expected. So assertions allow you to assert facts about responses received from the server being tested. Using an assertion, you can essentially test that your application is returning the result you expect it to. For example, if you have requested for a HTTP page from your server, and in the resulting response that you get from the server, you can check for the presence of the HTML tags in the response. If JMeter cannot find the text, then it will mark it as a failed request, because a HTML tag is the critical portion of HTML document, and without it, it would not be a valid HTML document. Hence, assertions form a very useful tool for validating of the responses that are being got from your web server or the system that you are currently testing using JMeter. Next comes the configuration elements. Configuration elements allow you to create defaults and variables to be used by the samplers. They are used to add or modify requests which are being made by the sampler. Some of the commonly used configuration elements provided by JMeter include: first one is the counter. Allows the user to create a counter that can be referenced anywhere in the thread group. The counter lets the user to configure a starting point, a maximum, and the increment. Then comes the CSV dataset. It is used to read lines from a file and split them into variables. Then comes the FTP request defaults, the HTTP request defaults, and then comes the HTTP authorization manager, which lets you specify one or more user logins for web pages that are restricted to using server authentication. You can see this type of authentication when you use your browser to access a restricted page and your browser displays a login dialog box. JMeter transmits the login information when it encounters this type of page. Then comes the HTTP header manager, lets you add or override HTTP request headers. Then the log config element lets you add or override username and password settings in samplers that use username and password as a part of their setup. Now let's see an actual example with the JMeter GUI. So before we actually start making test plans and running the JMeter test, it's essential to get used to the JMeter GUI first. So we'll just go through a couple of icons which are present. That is to create a new test plan to run the JMeter test. That is to import an existing template, open an existing test plan. The next one is to close the test plan which you have created. Save the test plan. Then it allows you to save the selected element as defined by you. Expand all the elements of the test plan. Then collapse all the elements of the test plan. This allows you to run the test plan. Then start the test plan without any pauses. Stop the test plan from running. And this is the most important icon which will give you the help. This contains the complete tutorial of how the JMeter tool has to be used for performance testing. Perhaps you need an internet connection for this, because this takes you to the browser tutorial. Okay, this is the place where all the error messages get logged. So when you run your test and if the test has failed due to some error, then this is the place where you look. Then that is the icon which indicates if the test is running. It will be set to green when the test is in progress and will be changed back to grey after the test has finished completion. Upon starting JMeter, you'll see two branches, which is the test plan and the workbench. Test plan is the place where your test elements will be living. The purpose of workbench is not really clear. It seems to be meant to be a place to do your throwaway experimentation. The really crucial tab of using workbench is, however, that JMeter will throw away whatever you put into the workbench upon exit. JMeter will not save the contents of the workbench if you tell it to save your work and you lose whatever is in there. It will only save the contents of the test plan branch. So you have to be careful of putting anything in the workbench. You are bound to get burned. And we have already encountered what a test plan is. So a test plan is the fundamental unit of JMeter, as you know. And There are options to specify the name of the test plan, comments if necessary, user defined variables if required, and several other parameters with respect to running of the threads. Now I'm going to begin with adding of a thread group. As you know, each thread represents a user. Thread group is a set of users which are accessing the server at a defined time instance pattern. There are also setup and tear down thread groups which occur during before and after the actual execution of the test plan. So now we'll go back to adding a thread group. You can specify the name of the thread group. Since we are going to do a HTTP server test using JMeter, I am going to name it as JMeter users. You can add comments if necessary. I don't think it's needed. Then you can choose your action to be taken after an error which occurs, a sampler error. I have set it to continue, indicating that even after an error occurs, the JMeter will continue to execute the other steps of the test plan. It can also be set to start the next thread loop or stop the thread, stop test or stop the test now. Then the thread properties, there are several functions to be set under that. First is the number of threads or users, which indicates the number of people who are going to be accessing the server. I'm setting it to 5. In the ramp up period, it has to be set in seconds. It basically, suppose for example you have 5 users and you set the ramp up period to be 5, then all the 5 requests to the server should have been completed before the end of the 5th second. That is what ramp up period means. Then comes the loop count, indicating the number of times you want to run the test. I have set it to 1. Forever indicates that it keeps running indefinitely until you close the JMeter GUI. I prefer to keep it as 1. You can also delay the thread creation if needed. I choose to keep it unchecked. Next, you can also schedule the configuration. That is, you can set the start and the end time of your test. You can see that it's set to the date as well as the time option in hours, minutes and seconds. So this essentially means that your test plan will start at this time instance of your computer time and stop at that instance. However, I'm uncomfortable with setting it that way. You can also specify the duration and also the startup delay. So now we are done with adding of the thread group as well as the appropriate settings for it. You can see that the thread group has now been added under the test plan. Now it's important to know that any other elements that you add to the test plan has to be added by right clicking the thread group, as in it has to come under the thread group and not under the test plan. This is the hierarchy which has to be maintained in JMeter, however inconvenient it may seem. So now I'm going to add a config element, and as you remember, it is used for setting the defaults of a particular request. Now since I want to create a HTTP request, I'm creating a config element to set up the HTTP request defaults. Essentially the idea is that suppose you make 100 HTTP requests to different pages of the same website. You don't want to be specifying the server name or the IP address every time. So config elements is just to create some defaults to prevent repetitive work. So the name would be HTTP request defaults itself, and the server name would be, I would be testing the JMeter website itself, which is jmeter.apache.org. And port number I'm not specifying, it will take the default port of 80 for HTTP requests. I can also set the timeouts in milliseconds for connecting as well as response being got from the server, which is the JMeter official website. Then comes the HTTP request parameters. There's not much to change here. The defaults will be considered. Then there's no need to set the path here, but when the HTTP requests, in the HTTP requests, I will be setting this value and leaving the server name or IP to the default. It's also possible to send parameters with the HTTP request. For each parameter, the name, the value, the option of whether it has to be encoded, as well as it can be checked for equality with some other value specified by you. If you are using JMeter behind the firewall or the proxy, then in that case you will have to specify the IP address or the server name of the proxy, the port number, the username as well as the password. You also have the option of setting parameters for embedded resource from the HTML files which have been returned. So now we are going to add a sampler of the HTTP request. Name, the first field is the name field. To be more clear, I would set it to home page because this request is for testing the home page of the Apache JMeter website. All these values will take their default values. All these fields will take the default values. Then please note that the method in this case is set to get, and the path we are setting to / because this is the home page, and we know that the default server name or IP address has to be taken from the HTTP request defaults, the config element which we had defined earlier. That is the use of defining the config element. Again, you can send parameters with the request. If you are using JMeter behind a proxy or a firewall, the server name, IP address, port number and username of that proxy is required for the proper functioning of JMeter. So now we have defined the HTTP request. The next thing you need to add under your thread group would be the now we are adding another HTTP request, and this would be to the changes page of the Apache JMeter website. The server name and all this field will be taken from the HTTP request default config element. Note that I am setting the paths to /changes.html. So now just look at the hierarchy of the test element. You have the test plan, and that you have a thread group called JMeter users, and then you have the config element called HTTP request default, and the HTTP request homepage and HTTP request changes. Note that the config element as well as the samplers are placed under the thread group and not directly under the test plan. So the only thing which is remaining is the listener. So next I'm going to add the view results in table after adding the graphical results. I can choose to save it at any location in my computer. I prefer to log only the success test cases. So for the save configuration, there are a number of configurable parameters. Now I run the test and look at the box which is set to green as long as the test is running. Now you can see the sample numbers, the start time of the test, the name of the thread, JMeter users 1 to 10, then the label indicating the page to which the HTTP request has been made, the time in milliseconds taken for completion of the HTTP request, the status which is set to green indicating the successful completion of the HTTP test, the number of bytes of data which has been got from the HTTP request being sent to the Apache JMeter websites of the home as well as the changes pages, the latency, as well as the time taken to make a connection to the HTTP request page. Now we can see the results in a graphical form. The number of samples are indicated on the x-axis and the time in milliseconds upon the y-axis. The average number of samples, deviation, the time of the latest sample, throughput, median. And note that the errors in the logs have been set to 0, indicating the successful completion of your HTTP request test in JMeter. Next we'll be seeing an SMTP request. So for this we will again create a test plan. First step includes adding a thread group which stimulates the number of users. I'm going to name it as Gmail users because I'm going to create the SMTP test for the Google Mail server. I'm setting the number of threads, ramp up period and loop count to 1, which are the default values. Next I'll be adding the sampler, that is the SMTP sampler mail sampler. I'm leaving the name as SMTP sampler itself. And the name of the server would be smtp.googlemail.com, which is the server name of Gmail. Then port number I'm setting it to 587. Then in this case I'm going to test the time taken to send an email from me to my inbox itself. Hence the from and the to address will be my email ID. Next I'm going to check the authentication settings and enter my username and password. Username will be my Gmail ID and password will be the Gmail password. Then under security settings I'm going to check use start transport layer security, and the subject of the email I am just setting it to a JMeter test mail, and subject would simply be test mail. I choose to send plain body text and not a multi-part mixed type of HTTP message. So the next step would be to add a listener to my test plan, and I prefer to see the results in the form of a table. Now I'm running the test. And it's green, indicating that the test is still in progress. So now we need to wait for it to finish in order to see the results. Okay, so now the one way to verify would be to open my Gmail ID and check if I have got the email. Yes, I have got it. You can compare, you can see the subject, which was JMeter SMTP test, as well as the body of the message, which was set to test mail in my JMeter testing. So this is how we create an SMTP sampler. So the next type of sampler would be an FTP request. So for this I again need to create a test plan. For this I will first add a thread group. I will set the name to FTP users and leave all the remaining thread properties to default values. Next I will be adding a sampler, which is an FTP sampler, FTP request sampler. I will leave the name as it is, and the server name would be the IP address of my virtual machine, which is installed on my Windows 7 desktop. The remote file would be the location on my virtual machine where I would want this file to get stored or uploaded. I would want it to store it in a folder called JMeter test in a text file called test in the C drive of my virtual machine. Then in the local file would be the location from where the source file has to be taken and uploaded into the destination, which would be the C drive of my VM. Then note that I am setting the method to put or store because I want to upload a file. This would be the username as well as password of the virtual machine because I want to upload the file into the VM. Next thing is, as usual, add a listener. I would prefer to view the results in the form of a table. I am changing the name to FTP results for better understanding. Now I run the test. You can see that the test is in progress. Yeah, now it's completed. So this is where my original file was stored on the desktop, JMeter, and it had the text JMeter test mail written inside it. Now I will see if it has been uploaded onto the virtual machine. I'm opening my VM. I'll go to the remote file location, which is C drive, in a folder called JMeter test. Yeah, we have seen that the text file has been created and the same text has been copied. So hence the FTP sampler has been run successfully. Okay, so now we move on to the practical assignment section. So based upon what you have seen in the tutorial by now, you must be able to solve these tutorials. So the first assignment involves retrieving an email using a mail reader sampler. So you need to write a test plan to retrieve emails from your inbox using the mail reader sampler, and the results can be viewed by using a view results in a tree listener. This is similar to the SMTP sampler that I had shown you in the tutorial. The only difference is that instead of sending an email using JMeter, you are now retrieving an email using JMeter. So the solution would be as follows. First, you create a test plan. Then you add a thread group with the appropriate configuration parameters. Then you add a mail reader sampler and the listener as a... Okay, so while you are adding the mail reader sampler, there are many configuration options. The options are protocol. The default is POP3, but however you can also set it to IMAP. Next comes the server host, which is the DNS name or the IP address of the POP3 or IMAP server. Next comes the server port, which is the port over which the POP3 or the IMAP server is listening or running over. Then standard ports will be figured out by JMeter itself depending upon the protocol that you have selected. Now with respect to the username, it refers to the username for the POP3 or IMAP server. Then password refers to the password associated with that username. Folder refers to the folder which can be specified for IMAP protocol. Then comes the number of messages you want to retrieve from your inbox. Next comes if you specify whether you want to remove the messages from the server after retrieval. Next, storage message using MIME. So you can check this box if you plan to use SMIAC assertion against the mail reader sampler, otherwise you leave it unchecked. Next comes the security settings, and the security settings must be exactly the same as that of SMT sampler, which was shown in this tutorial earlier. So these are the configuration parameters which need to be set for the mailer sampler. So once this is done, the next thing you have to do is pretty much just add the listener, which is the view results in a tree listener. So depending upon the number of messages you have chosen to remove to extract from your inbox, the listener must be able to show you the subject as well as the content of all the messages that JMeter has retrieved from your inbox. So this is a screenshot of the sampler. The name, then comes the protocol which is used, the server host which is set to pop.googlemail.com. Next comes the port, your username and password as well as the security settings. Then this is the listener. You can see 5 messages being retrieved, their header as well as content. Yeah, so you run it with one thread and it will see 5 messages. Next comes assignment 2, which involves retrieving of a file using FTP sampler. Please note that a tutorial was shown for storing a file using FTP sampler. So you need to write a test plan to get a file stored on the server using FTP sampler. So assignment, you first create solution, you create a new test plan, add a thread group, add FTP request, sampler, and then view results using a tree listener. Yeah, so the screenshot for adding a thread group, the test plan, and under that there's a thread group, and you've set all the values for the number of threads users, the ramp up period, as well as the loop count. Okay, next you have added a config element, which is the FTP request defaults under your thread group of FTP users. The server name is set to ftp.domain.com, which is another FTP default server which is present online, and note that the method is set to get. Next, you're adding a sampler for FTP request. Note the remote file refers to the file on the server which you want to retrieve, and note the method set to get, then your username and password for the server. Yeah, so you have remember that you had added an listener in the form of view results in a table. So all values such as start time, the status, then latency, all these values are shown in this table. Yeah, so that is the end of the JMeter tutorial, and I thank you for watching it, and I hope that it has helped you. Thank you very much.